I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two professors of political science who have just watched the first 3 episodes of Season 2 of The Night Manager. And we're going to share and talk about our instant reactions, maybe break down some of the themes and ideas that we see in the show. We've both just watched these episodes once. They've just been released. A decade since Season 1 of The Night Manager. Was unexpected to me that they were going to bring it back, but they have. And what do you make of the first 3 episodes of Season 2?
So I thought the first 3 episodes of Season 2 were promising in a lot of ways. I think Season 2 shares Season 1's dedication to the craft of acting and the craft of storytelling in ways that I think are really interesting and intriguing and joyful, I think, in a certain way to watch. We've got another really strong group of actors, some of whom are continuing, like Tom Hiddleston, who in some ways I think is actually portraying an even richer version of Jonathan Pine here in Season 2 than in Season 1. And I think there are a lot of parallels, right, between Season 2 and Season 1. And the one thing that's got me a little leery, right, is the way that episode 3 ended in the reintroduction of Richard Roper. And so Roper's presence stops being this kind of ghost in the machine that is, in the first couple of episodes, clearly meant to be important for helping us to understand Pine's character development over the previous decade. And it becomes literal. Roper's presence does. And I'm a little leery of that storytelling convention, and I'm a little leery about where Season 2 is going to go from here. And as we'll talk about, I am wondering whether this is the kind of storytelling twist or plot device that Le Carre himself would have employed were he to return to this material. So that's kind of my initial temperature check. What about you? What did you think of it?
Okay, so I like it, but I think reactions to it are gonna turn on some of the things that you've just talked about. You know, that there's going to be a critique of the show, right? Which is it's sort of a retread of Season 1. You know, a lot of the structures of the characters are the kind of same. Like a lot of the characters are sort of ghosts, you know, or have analogs in Season 1 characters. And then you could say, well, why do a Season 2? You know, the story was complete. So you could have that critique, you know, and you could say things like the sort of reappearance of the central villain from Season 1 is sort of a bit hackish and a bit kind of, aha, the monster is not really dead. Yeah. Or you can take another view, which is one of Le Carre's great themes was that neat resolutions don't really exist in the world. That the neat resolution, the clean battle between good and evil, in which the villain, you know, is defeated and the hero triumphs and everyone lives happily ever after, is a fantasy. And it was a fantasy in particular of Spycraft and of the Bondian kind of genre. And Le Carre always saw things as just, you know, a lot more muddled, a lot more ambiguous, and crucially never ending. Nothing ever ends, right? Conflicts are never really over. Things are never really resolved. And if individuals are kind of done away with, the universe will provide another individual to continue those things onwards. And as a literalization of those themes, I think having a Season 2 is very true to those Le Carre themes. Yeah. You know, and you could say Season 1 ended in a way that was fairly sort of classic, cathartic ending. Roper seems to get his due and Pine kind of walks away. The novel didn't end that way. Yeah. It was a much more ambiguous ending. And so in a sort of meta sense, the very fact of having a Season 2 makes The Night Manager as a televisual text truer to Le Carre's vision in the novel than Season 1, which is the literal adaptation of the novel, was.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that point leads me to the real strengths that I saw, particularly in the first episode. I do think that the first episode does a really good job of giving us this kind of really damaged and fractured character in Jonathan Pine. It portrays him in a certain way that I think is more persuasive than Season 1 portrays him. It's much clearer to me in Season 2 that this is a guy who has long-term sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, presumably from his time in the military in the Iraq War. And it helps you to understand why he is drawn to habitually to these nocturnal lifestyles that we're first introduced to him as being a part of, or as doing in Season 1. Well, in Season 2, he's doing essentially the same thing, right? Instead of the night manager, he's now he's literally the manager of the night owls. And what we learn is that he doesn't sleep, right? And I think it's fair to remember back to season 1, which I think we both watched in anticipation of season 2, both rewatched, I should say, in anticipation of season 2. And it's interesting to go back and say, okay, well, so clearly this was somebody who also was at the end of his rope, right, in season 1 when we first meet him. And he's barely kind of functional even then. And I thought the beginnings here of season 2, particularly in that first episode, I think are really strong with regard to deepening his character development and giving us maybe a character who feels more reminiscent of the Le Carre version of the character than we actually got, ironically, I suppose, in season 1, which is based, very closely on the novel.
Yeah, he was quite sort of jaunty and, is extremely charming and sort of upbeat. And in a sense, he's playing those roles to kind of insinuate himself with the Roper family. But also he kind of had that affect about him. And even Hiddleston as an actor, he had that youthful glow when you watch the things back to back. And now he's a sort of more, I don't know, pockmarked, or he's just a darker figure. He's a psychologically dark figure. He sort of inhabits the night, kind of literally and figuratively. He scares his psychologist, who finds him to be a very sort of dark figure. He screams at one point or exclaims, "Make me clean," clean me up. And you can never quite tell to what degree these are kind of the expressions of his most innermost torment, or to what degree he's kind of still a bit in control of himself and playing that role.
It's a bit of both, right? These manipulative moments at the same time that they're authentic expressions of insecurity and anxiety.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I thought was a really neat and clever device for storytelling in the first episode, which then kind of moves on very quickly, is Jonathan Pine. He's got this dog, right? And the dog's name is Corky.
Wasn't it a cat? Is it a cat? I thought it was a cat.
Okay, so it's a cat.
Yeah.
But the name is Corky, and Corky, of course, is the name of Richard Roper's basically
Major Corcoran.
Yeah, yes. His kind of consigliere in season 1 who Pine murders.
Right.
And so there's this. Again, we're dealing with a character here who's got a lot of guilt and a lot of trauma that he doesn't process in any meaningfully functional way, and he seems to be habitually finding himself thrown back into these circumstances that share or that peak on one hand his sense of duty and peak on the other hand his sense of trauma and anxiety.
Well, and they have what Pine had done to Corcoran was not only murder him, but he'd murdered him to replace him, to sort of assume not his literal identity, but his role in the Roper organization as the person who signs, who insulates Roper from kind of the paper trail, the public figure. The other thing that points up is, a lot of Pine's trauma is tied into this double movement, or this interconnection of kind of betrayal and eroticism, and the eroticism of betrayal, because the major trauma that's driving him, as we meet him in the story, is the Sophie Alakan trauma, which is erotic for him. He genuinely is at first erotically attracted and then in love with her in short order. But he also sort of betrays her, right? In that she entrusts him with secrets, and he thinks he is doing the right thing in passing them on, but he discovers, as in all Le Carre type spy services, that these are all penetrated, leaky institutions, and this ends up getting Sophie killed. And that was going on throughout season 1 with Pine and Jed's relationship, and it reemerges in season 2 in a way that I think is really sort of interesting and true to the character, and develops the character in what is turning into this sort of erotic triangle of betrayal between Pine and Teddy Dos Santos, and I'm sorry, I'm temporarily blocking on Roxana. That's it, and Roxana Bolaños, I guess the Jed character, the Jed archetype
character,
and that connection between eroticism and betrayal is really that's Pine's unique thing, I think, or at the core of it.
It's a great point. And as you say, it's also consistent with Le Carre in general, because I'm thinking about, we both also watched Errol Morris's documentary,
The Pigeon Tunnel.
And this is one of the big themes, right, of that movie, is that Le Carre is obsessed with betrayal.
Yes.
Right, in all of its forms.
Right.
Emotional, literal, geopolitical. And we see that. So it makes a lot of sense to lean hard into that theme right, for this story, which is both consistent with Le Carre and the original story, but as we say, kind of consistent with his broader sense of what was at stake in these kinds of behind the scenes spycraft world.
Well, and international and political, or national and international betrayal
Yeah.
are ultimately personal betrayals, right? They're accomplished through personal means, and the toll of them are personal as well. And one thing I teach in political science is international relations, and we're constantly told that this is like a science, and so it's about these grand forces, and maybe it's grand forces of kind of national power, or arms races, or rationality, or maybe you're told it's the kind of the pursuit of ideological, these grand sort of social forces that drive things.
Structural.
Yeah, and individuals don't really matter, and there are these impersonal, historical or rational forces that are driving things. And what Le Carre always points out, and it's absolutely to the fore in The Night Manager, is that no, most of that is sort of ephemera. It's not really driving things.
Yep.
Most of that is a lie, and all of these things are processed through actually personal motivations.
Yep.
So in his great sort of Cold War novels, the West and the East would proclaim these ideologies. What they really were a set of merit and sort of essentially morally equivalent bureaucratic organizations. The goal of the bureaucracies was to kind of exploit and chew up and use individuals, but the individuals who were engaging in betrayal would sort of get an erotic charge from it, or a delicious charge from it. And why are people doing the things that they're doing? And I think this applies to Pine and to the other characters in The Night Manager. That they're doing it, and it's something Le Carre says in the Pigeon Tunnel, because it's nice to think that you know something someone else doesn't know, or that you've got one over on someone else, or there's a sort of erotic charge about that, or you're feeling guilty about something, or you're working out some personal trauma, and it looks like it's geopolitics, and it looks like it's good versus evil, and all the rest of it. And these are titanic forces that are going on, but the titanic forces inside the heads and the hearts of pretty ordinary individuals.
Yeah, and I think crucially as well for Le Carre, it seems these are moments of betrayal that work themselves into the spy services themselves and up into the leadership. And here, again, reflecting back on the Errol Morris documentary, right, there's a long time that's spent on Le Carre's kind of obsession with the Kim Philby character, right, and the degree to which that betrayal at the highest levels of MI6, I think it was, right, which sort of shapes Le Carre's vision of the leadership dysfunction, right, that happens even within the organizations whose express purpose is to defend and to protect the nation. And we see that all over The Night Manager in season 1, in which we've got the corruption between Richard Roper's organization and the highest levels of MI6. We see it again, at least the beginnings of it here in season 2, in which there appears to be some not yet completely clear set of corrupt relationships between the new head of the River of MI6.
Yeah, the River House, Myra,
and Teddy Dos Santos.
Right.
Who are actually Roper again.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing that I think is going on is there are all these kind of unending or intergenerational traumas that are going on. And I think that's a key. So almost every character is carrying something that's kind of driving them on. And quite often it's a parent and child thing that's going on. Of course, Teddy Dos Santos is Richard Roper's son. We're shown for emphasis. Pine goes to visit Richard Roper's son, Danny from season 1, who is obviously and perfectly understandably, traumatized by the apparent death of his father.
But also by the betrayal of Pine himself.
Yeah. Who'd become this surrogate sort of father figure. Roxana's kind of carrying something from her father that seems to be driving her on. And then in a broader sense, Teddy Dos Santos, who's presented as an orphan, right, whose father and mother is not in the picture at all that we see, and whose father is presumed dead, is himself, recruiting kind of the orphans of Colombia to kind of amass an army to, it seems, reopen another kind of intergenerational trauma, the unfinished nature of the 2016 peace in Colombia, and it's the 10-year anniversary of that peace, and he's going to kind of blow that up. And this intergenerational trauma, this trauma between parents and children, this nothing ever ends, kind of suffuses the Night Manager. Pine says at one point, I feel like I'm chasing ghosts. Yeah. He's carrying all this trauma that's sort of within himself.
Yeah, trauma and guilt. And this was something that leads me to revisit a topic that we mentioned off camera, which is just how British is all of this, right? And the thing that comes to mind, and sort of setting you up, right, to discourse on this, given your own heritage, a lot of this is this kind of British post-colonial nostalgia, and that has worked out in real life, right? I mean, when forward-facing public British colonialism begins to fall into disrepute and then to get dislodged from the international stage, one of the characteristic responses of the British is to try to maintain their central role in world affairs or in the public eye by doing things like, mounting expeditions to be the first to climb Mount Everest, or mounting expeditions to arrive at the South Pole before anyone else, or mounting expeditions to be the first, to pass through the Northwest Passage. Then eventually, right, the theme seems to be that, like, there is this nostalgia for maintaining Britain's central role in world affairs, even if it's undercover, even if it's underground, literally and figuratively, even when it becomes fully illegitimate, like what's happening with the arms dealerships and the arms kinds of dealing roles that are being taken place, crucially, and orchestrated by British authorities on one hand and British citizens on the other hand. And so I do wonder if part of what's happening here is that the intergenerational trauma works at the level of national identity as well.
In The Night Manager as a story, that's clearly going on. And one of the things that motivates both Burr and Pine in the TV series and in the novel is specifically that Roper is British. Yeah. And he's kind of spreading the empire is gone. And so that capacity to kind of do violence and harm is gone. But in the post-Cold War kind of globalized, multipolar world, those kind of harms are being done more by individuals and individual adventurers. And Roper is a sort of individual adventurer of a particular sort. And it motivates both Burr and Pine to stop him from doing that because they feel it as a specifically kind of British responsibility. I think Pine says something to that effect in season one, and Burr in the novel talks about it a lot, and she's particularly annoyed by Roper because he has all these advantages that she, as a working class person, or sorry, in the novel it's a he, in the TV series it's she, he's been given all these advantages by the British society and British state, and has gone off, and this is what he's kind of done with it, and it's just kind of not the done thing, and it's something that a problem that has to be solved internally.
Well, and at least as season one has it, she's also particularly offended by Roper because he has seen the consequences with his own eyes of sort of British imperialism, and just as she has. They've seen the exact same thing, and it has motivated her in one way. It's motivated him in the most sinister and cynical possible of ways. And so it just continues this kind of inter-identity, international identity rivalry as well, right?
Yeah, and he's at the kind of broadest level. Roper's such a sort of nihilist and such a huge cynic, and is so sort of concerned with, I mean, yes, personal profit, but also just wants to have a good time. He thinks the world is rotten, so he can kind of act in rotten ways, not because he sees himself as kind of uniquely evil. It's just the whole, everyone is a hypocrite who doesn't say that the world is rotten, and everyone's kind of buyable under the surface and so forth. Yeah. And at some level, Burr, Pine, if you're not going to oppose that, right, then what are we actually doing here? What's sort of going on here? And I think it is significant that the Night Manager as a concept is le Carré's first post-Cold War novel, And, if you thought the Cold War was sort of this ideological shell game that was not really about much, and then the Cold War is gone, what is your next big historical question? And maybe that's what he was thinking. Is there anything going on other than just utter nihilism? And I think you can see in the Pigeon Tunnel, he never quite wanted to resign himself to that.
Yeah.
But I do think he fears that might be what's really driving history and is really going on.
Yeah, and then so let's spend a little bit of time talking about the Teddy Dos Santos character,
Yes.
who is presented, at least in the first moments or the first blushes of this season, as the main villain. We come to find that's probably not actually the case. But so his real name is Eduardo, right? He's the sort of quasi-legitimate son of Richard Roper, but somebody who has almost no interaction with him. He sees him once a year or so. The influence seems to be, minor for most of his childhood. But he goes by Teddy Dos Santos, so that's one tell. As we were talking about off, right? The shortening of Edward to Teddy is an Anglo convention. But the name so the chosen name, Teddy Dos Santos, so right, literally it's Teddy Two Saints.
Yes.
Right. And so it's on one hand, I suspect a reference to him being taken in by the church, right, and growing up as an orphan, right, within the Catholic Church. But like, who's the other saint? I mean, it seems like it's probably Roper, right? So it's, it strikes me that there's some meaning behind his chosen nom de guerre.
Yeah, one on each shoulder, right? One saint on each shoulder. Yeah, he's a compelling character.
Yeah.
And I do think it's his relationship with Pine and the kind of eroticism that's in that relationship is I think convincing, and is really adding kind of depth to what's going on there. Do you think he could stand on his own? Do you think we needed the father to actually re-enter the picture? You're right, that naming thing is good, because it's not only is Teddy an anglicized kind of contraction of Eduardo in this case, but Edward, but Teddy is to Edward as Dickie is to Richard.
Yeah.
Like it's sort of an upper class shortening. It's a kind of jaunty.
Yeah.
If you're from the working class and you call Edward, you're probably not going by Teddy.
Yeah.
You might go by Ted or Eddie or something like that.
Yeah.
Just as if you're Richard, you might be Rick, or you might be Richard. You're probably not Dickie unless you're actually quite well to do.
So that's really interesting, and it stands in contrast with the different names that Jonathan Pine takes on, which are never shortened as far as I can tell.
No.
Right? It's Jonathan, or it's Andrew, or it's Thomas.
Yes.
Right? All names that
they're all very solid Anglo-Saxon names.
all names that can be shortened and turned into
Yes.
these kinds of, as you say, these kind of jaunty
Right.
upper class names, and none of them ever are.
No, they're very solid Anglo-Saxon names. They're very kind of Le Carre Spycraftian in how they're chosen, in that there's nothing about them that you never go, ooh, like that's an interesting name.
Yeah.
You don't really remember it after it's gone, but it's also not so bland that it's just perfectly chosen to create just the right level of interest and the right level of instant forgettability, which is useful for someone like Pine, who's having to cycle through these multiple identities. And I thought there was a lovely, very clever moment where Teddy gets Pine drunk, gets him high, and then gives him kind of a truth drug or something. And it doesn't work on Pine. He's still able to spin his story.
It half does, right?
Well, I don't know. He told him he told him the cover story. He didn't tell him who he really is.
He also says stuff like "wash me clean," right?
Well, sure, but this again is you embed the lie in the truth, right? The most convincing lie is the one that's in truth, which I think for Le Carre is all discourse. Not even when you're trying to do Spycraft. Like, everyone is embedding their truth within a lie, and there's really no difference between the two. But I did think it was in a show that's a lot about ongoing trauma, about things never ending, and about chasing ghosts and people always being haunted by things. There is a question of a man in Pine who's been through so many spin cycles of identities and traumas and all the rest of it. He's like a copy of 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 a copy.
Yeah.
And then when you administer truth serum to a copy of a copy of what do you actually get? You're just going to get one of these now floating identities, and perhaps he doesn't quite remember he's real.
This is mimetic kind of identity circle, right, that just keeps on going. And to throw back to the very beginning of season 1, this is one of the things that Sophie says to him, right, immediately says, "Oh, now you're gone."
Yes.
Now you're here. Now you're gone. There's somebody else here now.
Yes.
And so that's a really interesting point. That so he's just cycling through different forms of identity. Does he even know at this point who he actually is?
Yeah. She says this, you're a different person every time, and I'd like one of you to make love to me.
Yeah.
And so she kind of fully, and that's, I think, one reason why she so imprints herself on him, in that she sort of instantly understands his nature and his truth.
Yeah. And Roxana does as well. I mean, the thing that seems to really scare her is his performance when he's totally strung out.
Right? How did you do that?
How the fuck did you do that?
Yeah.
That's what she says to him. And he doesn't really respond.
Right.
Presumably because it's instinctual at this point. But to your previous questions, could Teddy Dos Santos stand on his own? Yeah, I think he probably could.
Yeah. I thought he was quite compelling. And I've seen some online stuff where people were saying, it wasn't very memorable and Roper had to turn up and all the rest. I don't quite agree. I think it was absolutely fine. And, I think it's going to be interesting to have Roper back. And I'm sure there's extra twists as to what's really going on. They've obviously got to explain how it is that Burr, or why it is that she kind of agreed that he was dead when that was not true.
Was she duped, or
or is she? Is there some other twist going on involving her? The last thing I thought we'd talk about is, Le Carre is often held up as the anti-Bond, and he started kind of writing this stuff because he was annoyed by the cleanliness and the glamour of the Bond character. So that's just not how it's like. I think there is a great irony here in that Jonathan Pine, for all the reasons we've been talking about, comes off very much as, he's not without quite the physicality in both kind of, body shape, but also in the way he behaves. But in psychological demeanor and affect, he is very much like Daniel Craig's Bond. And Le Carre was the anti-Bond in the Sean Connery, Roger Moore type of thing. And Daniel Craig's Bond was a psychologically damaged, brutal person. I'll never forget showing students Casino Royale just a few years ago, and I still had this kind of memory of Bond as this, or I was operating with this image of Daniel Craig as the glamorous Bond, and they were shocked. They just said he's a psychopath, and that's how he reads when you don't have those associations. And so ironically, kind of, Le Carre starts out as the anti-Bond. Bond comes to Le Carre, and Pine now reads as certainly the Daniel Craig era Bond.
Including, as you've mentioned, the homoeroticism of the characters.
Which was a thing going, the Teddy Dos Santos reads to me a little like Silver, the villain in Skyfall. There's an element of similarity going on there.
Yeah. And the doubling, right?
Yes.
And that's the other thing that's starting to happen, is that the villains double with our putative hero. And we get that in Roper and in Pine, both of whom have, as far as the world knows, been dead over the exact same amount of time.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so those are our thoughts and reactions to the first 3 episodes of The Night Manager. We're going to do this weekly. There's one episode coming out a week now. We would love to get your views. This is just what we came up with and thought after one viewing. We would really love to have those ideas tested, challenged, added to. What do you see in the show? Are you happy that it's continued? How do you read the Pine character? Did Richard Roper really need to show up again? Any of the other things that we've talked about, please, add some comments. And we'll be back next week. And on that bombshell,